This is a picture of Harrison and me, taken on the occasion of his 80th birthday. We had a very large party at our house with over 400 people, and Martin Weinberger came himself to take this picture for the Courier newspaper of Clermont.
Today is October 2nd, 2001. This is the World War II Oral History Project for the Pomona College alumni classes of 1935 through 1951. The project is part of the World War II symposium titled Focus on a Generation, Pomona College and the World War II Years. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If we could start, if you could tell us your full name, please.
My name is Marguerite Loyau McIntosh.
And what year were you born?
I was born in Paris on August 11, 1925.
Excellent. And could you tell us a bit about your parents?
Yes, I was the oldest of 5 children, born of a couple of artists. My father was a sculptor, and my mother was a sculptor also. Actually, they met at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And my mother became more of a painter later on, and then she went back to sculpture herself, actually finishing the works of my father when he died in 1936.
Wow.
I could tell you a few words about him.
Sure.
He was a war hero first, and he remained as a reserve officer later on. He had done he was in infantry first. He had to interrupt his studies at the École des Beaux-Arts to go to war. In fact, he volunteered during that First World War. And he was sent back to Verdun 3 times.
Wow.
And he got all these medals, a lot of them, at the Battle of Verdun. And after the war was over in France, he continued as a pilot, as an airline pilot in the Polish War, in the war in Poland. And then he remained in the reserve later on. And after the war, of course, he went back to his studies. And when he was only 27 years old, I still don't know exactly how he became acquainted with Mr. William Bennett, who was the chief architect of the city of Chicago in the United States. And Mr. Bennett designed the Buckingham Fountain. And I wish I could find out now, but somehow he got in touch with my father, or maybe they had a competition. Anyway, my father was given the commission of doing the large seahorses, which are spread around the fountain of the Buckingham Fountain, which was the biggest fountain in the world at the time. I had an occasion years later to visit the machine rooms under the fountain. And it was as large as the bottom of a big transatlantic boat. Wow. It was incredible. And of course, this is, as you may know, this is the pride and joy of the city of Chicago. In the summer, beginning in May, they have a light show with the waters. And people gather by the thousands around the fountain every night. Well, in fact, when my father did his last trip to go and deliver the sculptures and to assist at the inauguration in 1927, he met a senator from France who gave him this document that I showed you about the inauguration, the celebration of the arrival of Lindbergh in Paris. And my father had known Mermoz, and he probably had talked to Lindbergh himself because he was very active in the airfield. When I was 10 years old, just practically a few months before he died, actually, I remember that he took me to the 14th of July parade at the Arc de Triomphe, and he was in the parade, and I was on the front row, and I was very proud of my father. When he died, he had been gassed during the First World War, and pneumonia took him away. We had 3 days of speeches and official ceremonies, and then an official train took him to his birthplace in the region of Tours, where he is buried now. But after that, was 1936. My father, who had made his fortune not only with the Chicago Fountain, but with big commission at the entrance of he was charged with the main entrance of the colonial exhibition in Paris in 1931. And then the Depression hit Europe, and he lost every penny. We were living in a 30-room mansion with 5 servants, and everything had to disappear all at once. My mother, who was not interested in taking care of babies, she had 5 of them, so she kept the nurse, and she took the rest. She did the rest of the work. She preferred to cook. But she was a very good mother. And when she found herself a widow with 5 little children, it was very hard for her. After all the official ceremonies, she found herself alone. No relative to help her. She was an artist. They did not think that she deserved to be helped. So life became very different by then.
Sure.
A few months after my father died, I was very lucky to enter the Legion of Honor for my education. The Legion of Honor is still today a very important institution of education in France. It was created first by Madame de Maintenon, the wife of Louis XIV, and it was done for the young ladies who were of the high nobility of France, but very poor. Afterwards, after the revolution, of course, the revolution closed all that. After the revolution, Napoleon I reinstituted the Legion of Honor under the name of the Legion of Honor for the daughters of his officers who had received the Legion of Honor for bravery on the battlefield. And it's still that way today. Of course, nowadays, famous artists also receive the Legion of Honor. They don't have to be of military prowess. So I was assured of a very good, excellent education if I could take this discipline, because it was very military.
Sure.
I cried every night in bed for a whole year, I remember, because my father was very important to me.
Sure.
And all my other brothers and sisters were put in an orphanage, a nice little orphanage, although very poor, for the orphans of artists. And eventually my 2 sisters followed me at the Legion of Honor, but they didn't finish their studies. It was very difficult.
Sure.
But when I passed my baccalaureate, at the end of the war, we were known at the Sorbonne. All students have to pass the baccalaureate, and those of Paris always passed at the Sorbonne. And we were known, and we were given the most difficult subject in the oral exam because they were challenging us.
Sure. So so you entered in 37?
I entered in fall of 36.
Okay. And
now the war came in the middle.
Sure.
And my mother at that time, when the war was declared, of course, the war was declared in France in September 39.
Right.
And nothing happened really in France at the time for several months. So we spent the winter preparing for the war. We really filled our pantries with rice and flour and sugar and everything we could find that was not perishable. We had no refrigerators in those days. And my mother was able, because she had received a little money from her father, she was able to buy a small little farmhouse in a country where her father had lived. Her father was a painter too, an artist and a scholar. So we, with our old car, we made trips on weekends to the country. It was about 200 miles away, to furnish with small furniture that we could move ourselves. So we had a place when the war really started, and when the German army arrived like a tidal wave from the north, we had a place to escape the city and the bombardments. So my mother, at that time, as a young widow, she had to accept a job as a teacher of art, but she had to go to the south of France in Clermont-Ferrand, which is a large city in the center of the central mountains of the Massif Central. And she started there the year after she was a widow, I think, in 1938. And she had become very well acquainted with the ladies of the owners of the castles in the mountains, who would come and spend the winter in the city during the cold month. And she was living in a pension because she didn't think she could stay as a woman alone in a hotel. And she had made very good contacts there. Then she had become acquainted with an artist, a widow also, who, with her, formed a private art school, and so they did some activities there. So when the Germans arrived, she quickly came back with her big old car, made the round around Paris, because the Legion of Honor was in the region of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, in the forest outside, southwest of Paris. My brothers and sisters were in the north of Paris, and they had been moved to Normandy, some of them. So she had to make the round to get us. A little detail is that when she came to get me, of course we were cloistered in the middle of the forest, I really had my first impression of the war then. I saw the road to Paris completely jammed with people arriving from Belgium and Holland with carts pulled by oxen, with the grandmothers dying in the carts and the mothers giving birth to new babies. It was incredible. You know, the typical refugee pictures that we see now in photographs, but as a young girl, it really was very impressed. I was very impressed by that. So as soon as she had all of us, we made all the arrangements to go to the country. Of course, we didn't stay there on a regular basis, but at least we had a place there. Well, at first we stayed there. Yes, at first we stayed there. And we had some other friends, neighbors, who came with us, joined us, because they had no place to go. And by the time we got settled in our little house in the country, we were 24 living there. We had put straw in the attics for the overflow to sleep there. And we stayed there about 2 weeks. Then the Germans arrived. So we left, we packed the car, we put the mattress and the bicycles on top of my mother's old car. And we even took along a big Chinese Buddha, a gigantic head in solid and light wood from the 14th century that my father had bought at the equivalent of Sotheby's. And my mother wanted to take at least one precious thing. She thought it would bring us good luck, but I think she also thought she could sell it in an emergency. And we hit the road south, and in fact, years later, long after I was married to Harrison here, I found out that Clermont-Ferrand was where the majority of the Parisians ended. But it took us several months to get there. First, we had to cross the Loire River, which divides the north and south of France. And of course, it took 2 days just waiting to cross the bridge. There had a lot of bridges, but you know, any bridge. And we finally crossed the bridge, and the bridge blew up 3 minutes after we had crossed. I found out years later, because here at Pilgrim Place, I found a whole library of books on the history of the war, books which were published in the clandestinity, and I have them at home. And they were done in very poor paper, of course.
Sure.
Well, I found out that actually the Germans did not blow all these bridges. They were behind us anyway. A French officer thought he could stop the German army, and he had ordered all the bridges to be blown up. So, of course, he didn't stop the German army, naturally. I remember that as soon as we had crossed the bridge, we ended in a farm where the farmers were kind enough to let us sleep in a stable. And the next morning, they came to milk the cows. And for the first and last time in my life, I learned to milk cows. And then we ended up in a little town near La Rochelle on the coast of the Atlantic. And there, of course, anybody who had some place was required, had a room requisition. And we found ourselves, my mother and our 5 children, living in one room in the home of 2 old maids, very nice. And of course, there was no running water except the faucet on the courtyard, where I had to wash all the clothes and the dishes and everything in cold water. And we lived like that. We were lucky to have that for 2 months. And one day the Germans arrived, and at the end of the Mass on Sunday morning, the town crier announced that the Germans wanted every refugee to be out within 2 hours. The ones who would be still there after 2 hours would be shot on the spot. So we quickly put the mattress and everything back on the car. And in the city of Niort, when we arrived, my mother almost died. It was just too much for her. She was always very courageous and always talking about, oh, look at the little birds and the beautiful landscape, but it was very much. So, in fact, we had 2 blowouts at the same time. Of course, our tires were terrible. Sure. We had gasoline only because we found flyers who were running away from the Germans and who would sell us gasoline from airplane at black market prices. So we kept going that way. Well, we spent the night in our car first. And the next morning, and it was near the market, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we were awakened. My mother was dying. And I looked for a place to put her, a hospital. And I ran into a girlfriend from boarding school while looking for the hospital. And she put us in the hands of her parents, and they took care of my mother. And they found a hotel room to put me and the 2 children and the 4 others. And I remember taking time to wash them because we had not had time to wash for days. In fact, I was becoming quite sick then because I had sleeping in a refugee school on bare mattresses. I had contacted some kind of leprosy. And I was in bed for 6 months after that with the flesh decomposing down to the bones. I somehow recovered. You know, there are miracles always along circumstances like this. And let's see, I received that terrible infection in the town of Aubusson, which is famous for the tapestries. Then we ended up in Clermont-Ferrand, and of course my mother knew a lot of people there. And I have this picture. Should I show it now?
Sure.
This is the only picture I have of that period of the war. And this represents the old car of my mother with the mattress and the blankets and our belongings on the top, and a couple of wooden suitcases or trunks. There's a bicycle here, and my mother is at the wheel looking for the directions, and that was me and my sister and my other sister and my 2 little brothers. And we had, of course, put our only good clothes to arrive to see our friends.
So where did you
nice.
find out from there?
Yes. So we stayed in Clermont-Ferrand for about 6 months. And the son of my mother's best friend, who was her only boy, she had 2 or 3 other girls. The son was just about 6 months older than me. He was not 16 years old. And he was an exceptional young man, very, very outstanding. Well, he volunteered for the resistance against the German. Of course, there was nothing really formed yet, but they were already talking about it among the young. And one day while he was learning how to clean his gun with his friend by accident unloaded his gun in his stomach and killed him. So this was the first event of my life caused by the war. So anyway, after 6 months, the Germans were well entrenched in the north of France. By then, the Vichy government was established and so on. And we had to go back to Paris under the German occupation because we had to return to our activities and our studies. So I went back to the Legion of Honor. And of course, I didn't go back to the first building of the Legion of Honor, which was in the forest of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, because that was occupied by the German. But they left us, so the students of the Legion of Honor were all put together. By then I was in, I don't know what level, but I was close to the baccalaureate. Well, see, had 3 more years. In an old 14th century monastery, which is adjacent to the Basilica Cathedral of Saint-Denis, where most of the kings of France are buried. And I finished my studies there. Once the infirmary was bombarded and destroyed, but we were in the cellars. We were always in the cellars at night, 2 or 3 times a night.
Sure.
This is where I did most of my home study because I was studying piano, and that was taking time out of my hours of homework. So I was counting on the airline, how do you call that? Bombardment alerts to do my studies.
Wow.
So I was studying in the cellar, and it was a little shaking, but that's all. 14th century cellars in the monasteries are very strong.
Sure.
But of course, they didn't want to take another chance. And after that bombardment, we were put in a Renaissance castle, the castle of Écouen, further north of Paris. And eventually, I finished my studies there.
Excellent.
The only event we had is that an English flyer fell with his plane in the park. Of course, all these young girls were all excited, but we were not given a chance to see him. He was, of course, whisked away because they didn't want the German to get him. Then, let's see, this was still the wartime.
So 43 now?
I was in 43, and of course, I had to help my mother, she had no money. And she was very well known as an artist, but she had never gone through the studies for teaching credentials because she didn't need to before the war and her widowhood. So she had great difficulty finding a job in Paris. In France, the government and the education system is so centralized that you always have to start teaching in the provinces and work your way to Paris. It takes 20 or 30 years. I was very lucky to go to start teaching in Paris right away. Of course, at first, in 1943, I first was the few, well, anyway, I started teaching, mostly tutoring first, the first year, and then I got a teaching job in Paris in a private school where I had been as a little girl. There, it was a lot of work for me because I just finished my humanities. And I wanted to teach art and art history, but I was told that they needed a professor of general history to prepare the students who were my age for the baccalaureate.
Sure.
I finished my baccalaureate quite early. Most of them finish at 18, 19, or 20. So I had to spend my night studying the battles of Napoleon and the stories of Joan of Arc and so on, and go to the library. Of course, my father had a big library too,
Sure.
to do my lectures on all these things to prepare my students. And at the same time, I was going to the École des Beaux-Arts. I had passed the competitions and entered the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And there I was, of course, exposed to the first underground students, because the war was really going on. We were under the German occupation, and the resistance army was just being formed. And actually, the center of resistance at that time was in a few spots, but mostly at the École des Beaux-Arts, because the students of the Sorbonne and the École de Médecine, medical school, and all those other branches of the universities were much more living independence of their parents. They were not free like the artists. Right. Most of the young men and women, mostly the men I was with, at the École des Beaux-Arts, were from families in the middle of France somewhere. They had prepared for 4 or 5 years in an École des Beaux-Arts in the provinces and worked their way up to Paris. So they lived on their own. They were much more free. And I got involved with them, and we started a little nucleus in resistance underground, getting organized and so on, and knowing people. At the same time, as the École des Beaux-Arts, I was also attending another school to prepare myself to teach art in Paris, because I wanted to stay in Paris. That was also competitive. Sure. And we had classes only once a week, but all of us had already had enough art training to teach, so we were giving teaching substitutions, first on a temporary basis, and then on 1-year contracts, and eventually full professorship there. So I did those studies there for 4 years at the same time as I did the Beaux-Arts. And I can come back to the activities in the underground afterwards, but I could tell you chronologically, in 1949, I had been teaching quite a few years there now. By then, I applied to come to California. My mother had visited the United States when my father had gone. She had visited at the time of the inauguration of the Buckingham Fountain in Chicago. And she had dreamy illusions about the United States. To her, it was the absolute El Dorado. Right. Because she was received at the Rockefeller with eating in gold plates, and she thought everybody lived that way. Sure. At least, she was always an artist who was always dreaming. It was wonderful. She was great for that. So she always encouraged me to go. And this is how I came here, because I applied for a Fulbright fellowship, and I got it, and was invited by President Lyon to come here in 1949-50, and this is how I'm connected with Pomona College. Sure. Maybe I should go back now to the activities in the war. Sure. While I was at the Beaux-Arts, I met especially 2 young men who were really the leaders in all of this, the formation of the underground. And of course, I was much younger than they were. They were 25,
Sure.
and I was 17 and 18. So I really did not want, and they didn't want to give me anything too dangerous or to give me too much information. I was put in a dangerous place because I had to take their place whenever the Gestapo was looking for them. But I knew as little as possible in case I was caught, naturally. Several times, they felt that they were in danger themselves. So they would give me their job, which was mostly for me to pass on the letter to somebody and wait for the train at the train station to meet a certain person. But of course, the trouble is that the trains were always hours late. And I had to be there and wait. Sometimes I had to wait all night. And of course, between trains, the train station was totally deserted except for the Germans doing the rounds. So I had to spend my time freezing, hiding behind posts or behind carts so that they wouldn't find me, because that would have been dangerous, of course. But I didn't know it very much.
Sure.
I knew as little as possible. And sometimes I had to walk back afterwards, of course. Sure. You know, quite a few times I had to walk back, and usually I walked back following the river, following the Seine. You know, at that time I was living still at my mother's house, and I was always very busy with my brothers and sisters every night and so on. And to walk back to where my mother was, I would just follow the river. You know, it was a few miles, but you couldn't, you know, there was curfew, so I couldn't be in the street. So I had to follow the river at the water level, down below, way 20 feet below. And of course, there were no Germans there, because the German soldiers were being killed. Always, if they would be isolated, they were being assassinated. And I don't know if you know, but the system for the German army was, they were very, very disciplined themselves. But if one German soldier was killed in a section of Paris, the Germans would round out 10, 12, usually 12 young people, or 12 people they would find in the street after curfew, and take them to the police station. And if a German was killed that night in that section, all 12 were being shot. In fact, they were shot behind my mother's house in the Bois de Boulogne, which was just a block away,
Sure.
2 blocks away. And we could hear the shooting every morning at 4 o'clock. So I had to be careful not to be seen, that's all.
Sure.
And I did that many times, walking back to my house. And then another thing, we were at the academy. I was at the Beaux-Arts in the morning, and in the afternoon, very often, I would go to the Academy of the Grande Chaumière in Montparnasse, and there were a lot of Germans there. So we had the chance to talk to them, you know, as friends, but we could get a lot of information from them. That's how, from one thing to another, we would get together at the Coupole where Hemingway used to meet with his friend and Gertrude Stein and all these people. And we would stay there and talk for a long time and plan our things or talk about our studies and plan the resistance and all these things together. About the war, well, I should tell you that in the middle of all this, of course, we had a lot of bombardments. That was American bombardments. Sure. And the problem with the Americans is that they were bombarding the city from way up high with big bombers, out of reach of the anti-aircraft guns. When the Germans were bombarding, they would take smaller planes and dive on target.
Right.
That was so they did a lot less damage among civilians.
Sure.
But when we had a major bombardment, and we had quite a few, of course, with my mother, we would go afterwards. of course, during the bombardment, we were on the roof admiring the sky because they used those great big fireballs that looked like beautiful lanterns in the sky. So we were admiring all this beautiful illuminated sky because the roof of our house was a flat terrace. And then right afterwards, we would go with blankets and so on and find people. And every time we would bring back a family who would stay with us for a few days or a few weeks or whatever until they found room. During that period, the first years, when I was just out of boarding school, one of the things I did was to be a governess for a family near the school where I was teaching. And it just happened by pure chance that the man of the house was the uncle of my boyfriend who was in the underground with us. But this man had many children, 4 or 5 children, and his wife was absent because she was always sick, ill when doing pregnancy. So I was in charge of the household with the children, and of course he was in charge of the railroads of France, so he had a lot of reserve for himself, crocks full of eggs and butter and cupboards full of wool blankets and so on, and I had to keep inventory of all that and give the orders to the cook and to the maids and take care of the 13-month-old baby who had dysentery. And what was I going to say about him? I forgot now. I don't remember.
That's okay.
Anyway.
So when the Allies finally landed in Europe, what was that like? How did things change?
Oh, yes. Well, at that time, I should tell you. Yeah, I know what I wanted to tell you. Mm-hmm. This gentleman asked me to take the place of his wife, who had been directing a relief center for the very poor people in the northern part of Paris, near Saint-Denis, where I had been educated. So I went there because we had a terrible American bombardment, which absolutely shaved flat for the 2.5 or 3 miles between the door of Paris and the city, Saint-Denis with the cathedral. It was absolutely flat because of the railroad going straight there, on about a mile wide. Everything was destroyed there. So she asked me to go there to see what I could do to reopen the relief center. And I found out that where the office was supposed to be, there were still something standing up there, and I found the files, except that there were 3 bombs that had not exploded, so it was, of course, cordoned off, and the police didn't want me to go there, but I managed to go by the railroad track, and I found in a file, I found the address of the cook, and I looked for him in the middle of the ruins, of course, and his building had been sliced in 2, and I found him on the top of his building in his apartment. All his dishes had been pulverized in his cupboard, but he was willing to come back and see what we could do. So he went to the center, and he started to work the stove. Meanwhile, I went to the city hall, which was 2 miles away. I had to walk through the ruins to get orders for potatoes so that he could start making soup. And something I never forgot is that while walking through the ruins along the main avenue, full of dust, of course, I saw this looks very much like what we saw the other day, on television. I saw a group of people. I went to find out what it was. There was a woman there kneeling. The house had fallen. There was a pile of and she was holding a hand of her little 4-year-old daughter who was trapped under the stone. And the hand was getting blue already. Sure. So she asked the little girl if she hurt, and she faintly said no. She was already very bad. So when I went to get the potatoes in the city hall, I asked for a doctor, and I found out afterwards that the doctor had to give her a shot to kill her. So that was, a small detail that happens now and happened again in our country just a few weeks ago. So anyway, you were asking me when the American landed.
When the Allies invaded, what was that
Yes.
like?
I was not in Paris when Paris was delivered. Because in the summer, when we didn't have our studies, we would go to that little house in the country.
Sure.
Because we could find more food there. We had made trips there, sometimes on foot, because the train sometimes could not go because bridges were blown and we had to walk and so on. And we did a lot of trips on bicycle, and every time a plane would fly over, we were always worried that it would be a German plane that would just for fun dive on us and kill us. So we would have to jump into the ditch. And of course, we had our bicycles full of eggs and live chicken and so on, riding back to Paris. And of course, the eggs would break, and we had to drink half a dozen raw eggs at once after the plane was over. Anyway, when the American arrived, we were in the country. And of course, for the 2 summers before the arrival of the American, we had been forming a resistance organization there with the young people from Paris who had families or, there. And some of them I still see when I go to France because they became friends of our family. And our leader was the veterinarian of the village. And we really prepared. We were organized. The funny thing is that the farmers who had done the First World War wanted our guns. They say, you are kids, you don't know how to use a gun, we have to have them. And my sister's boyfriend, I remember, had his gun taken, snatched away like this by an older farmer. And he was sitting on the threshold of his house crying because he had lost his gun. Human things.
Sure.
And the Americans knew that they will have to get ready to go. And they were grouped together in a forest, one on the one side of town and one on the other. On one side, near Le Mans, they had 2,000 guns there, cannons and men. And the other side, they had about 2,000 also with horses, cavalry, mostly Cossack horses. And I had heard that they were selling horses to get rid of the older ones, I guess, before running away. So I went, that boyfriend I was just talking about, who was like a brother to us, took me on his motorcycle. He dropped me off at the edge of the forest because he didn't want to be caught, of course. And I walked. I was in a pretty dress, and I walked as if I were very courageous. But there was a German soldier at the end of each tree. But they were very tired. Many of them they looked like Russian peasants. That was the leftover of the German army.
Sure.
And they just looked at me, And I asked where was the officer. They told me to take that little dirt road inside the forest. So I went. By then it was after 4 o'clock and it was getting dark. It was spooky. And the German officer was very polite. We talked in English because he didn't speak French. And I knew enough English. Sometimes I didn't know my English well, but sometimes we use Latin words. And I acted as if I'm sure he thought I was the daughter of a rich farmer. I didn't look like a farmer, but and he brought a horse, and I asked to see him run. I didn't know anything about horses. So they took the horse to the road, and I could see him could run. And I looked I had been told I had to look in his teeth. Of course, I didn't know what to look for. And so I said, fine. And I paid him the equivalent of $6. And then they very gallantly put their hands so that I could climb on the horse. No saddle, of course. And I took a hold of the mane. And I rode back about 4 miles to the town. And I love animals, so I got along very well with them, and he was my friend right away. He had to go on a very steep dirt road once, and he balked a little bit, but I managed to talk him into it. And when I arrived, the priest of the village with his black robe and his big black hat took his hat and saluted me. Well, a few days later, actually maybe 2 days later, the Germans decided to start resistance. So they put cannons at the corner of every street. And then an hour later, they changed their mind. The cannons disappeared, and the Germans disappear. There were still a few while we knew that the American army of General Patton was in Le Mans. And the French people were already putting flags at their windows, and of course the last Germans who were there were shooting at the flags and at the windows. And finally, General Patton arrived. First a few tanks, and then a little jeep with 3 generals. And the one in the middle must have been Patton. He looked very grouchy. And of course I had my sister and a friend and myself with a white dress, red, white, and blue dress, with a big wreath of flowers, and we put that on the trunk of his little jeep, and he went on. He didn't say anything. And then after that, a lot of tanks continued to arrive, and many of them stopped on the public square in front of the church, and they hoisted us on top of the tanks to take pictures. That's the first of the American army that I saw. Well, of course, life was difficult after that 4 years, because it took a long time, I didn't tell you that in spite of the disaster of my father's death and his ruined situation, we were able to stay in our big house, although it was not. My father was never able to buy it because it was never for rent. He was renting, even though he had built a huge 3-story high studio adjacent to the house to do all these big sculptures. And the park was the whole length of the street, and it was filled of sculptures. So we were able to keep our house. And when we came back from the Exodus, we found our house inhabited, completely intact.
Wow.
Because the German headquarters was just a few houses further, and they had occupied all the other houses.
Sure.
But in a way, they protected our house because they respected the fact that my father had been a war hero, and it was a large family. So we found our house intact. Right. Yes, that was a little amusing story. Is that we first saw the German. They were always extremely polite. They knew how to torture people when they would catch them. In the Rue du Cherche-Midi, where I had my apartment as a young, they had the political prison there. But otherwise, in the subway, they taught the French people how to give their seat to a lady. The French didn't know how to do that. And of course, there were some good Germans. We have a very good friend. That's another story I should tell you, which is interesting. Anyway, after the German, we should take a little rest. Oh, you may have to do a lot of editing. I wanted to tell you first, we had a little wrought iron grill entrance beside the big one for the cars. With the Germans, they never came, never bothered us. When the British came, first we had, then we had the British Army first, before the Americans. And they came and they broke the gate. So my mother went and asked the general headquarters if they could please repair the thing. And they would always say, yes, madam, we certainly shall take care of it, and so on. And they never did.
Right.
Then the American army came. They didn't bother with the gate. They just jumped over the wall. And the garden was full of Americans making love with French girls in the bushes. That was that's pretty typical. But we had a beautiful story with the German family. No, that was a German army, but nothing against the German themselves. One of the German visited us when, in fact, we had just come back from the Exodus. We had just returned from the Clermont-Ferrand. My mother was having tea in the garden with a friend, and I was around there when I saw a slender, tall German officer walk in. And of course, my mother and I immediately thought they were coming to requisition our house. Well, instead, he told us that he had been an artist during the war and that he was admiring the sculptures and he would like to come and see them in the garden. He had seen a little bit from the street. And then he asked to visit the studio of my father, and then he asked if he could come back to do a little bit of sculpture in the studio during his 3 hours. And of course, my mother was not about to say no to the occupant. And of course, we had not heard about any of the atrocities that any war hold. So we thought, well, he's the occupant. We might as well try to get along as well as we can. So the next day, he arrived, and as soon as he came, he changed into his tennis outfit because he realized that we did not like to see his military outfit. Sure. And we became very, very close friends. I even went to the Rodin Museum in Paris with him. I could have had my head shaven for that. Sure. But, in Paris, you can be incognito enough. And I was quite a lot younger than he was, so for him, he made a bust of my sister who was younger yet. Wow. And we remained very good friends. He was friend of the family, and to him, he told us later, my mother was a spiritual mother to him and a great inspiration. She was for many, many people, including this young man who was Pep Gollwitzer. Well, the war was ended. Oh yes, first of all, I finished at the Legion of Honor. I started at the École des Beaux-Arts and in the underground. And my mother kept needling him, telling him, all of you young boys, you are going to get killed for your Hitler, who is a madman. And of course, he couldn't say anything. But he also found out that I was in the underground. We never talked about it, of course, but I'm sure he knew. So one day he came and he told my mother that he had asked for a transfer because otherwise he would have had to give our name to the Gestapo. So we didn't see him again for years. Then I came to this country with my Fulbright to teach at Pomona College. I was in the French house before Oldenburg Center was built, and I had classes of conversation, and I could take all the courses I wanted in the graduate school where Harrison was on his GI Bill. And after 1 year, I went back to France. And meanwhile, he had written to my mother, who had never answered because it was too close to the end of the war and it was difficult. And anyway, she neglected it. But then he came to see her with his wife. And then years later, after Harrison and I were married, we were designing together as a team of designers for the Mikasa company. And the first year we were sent to Germany. We were sent after that for 10 years. Every summer when I was not teaching, we were in Japan to design dinnerware. But that first year, we were in Germany near Munich, where Pep Gollwitzer was living. Wow. And my mother reminded me that, and she said, why don't you try to find him? We did, and Harrison and I went to Munich one weekend. We took the train, I guess, or a car. Anyway, we met in a cafe across from the railroad station. And I remember this long, slender officer. And I saw this short, bold, German who looked just like the former Dr. Bowman, who taught German here at Pomona College. You had heard about him. And he was with his little wife, was with a Tyrolean cape. And they were wonderful. They took us to their house, he had become a successful sculptor, mostly working with architects.
Wow.
And she was an artist herself. And we have become the closest friend.
That's wonderful.
And years later, when I was directing tours, after we stopped as designers, I directed tours of Europe for tourist cultural tours, because I could lecture on the arts and so on. And when we were in Munich, every time we would be received by Pep and his wife. A whole group of Americans went to his house and his studio, and it was just wonderful.
That's great. That's great. Well, maybe we'll put the pictures on the other tape. How's our time? A couple minutes, 5 minutes. Okay. So after the war, how soon after the war did you come out to Pomona?
I came to Pomona in 1949, 50.
Excellent. And what was that like for you?
Well, it was a wonderful experience. But I should tell you, I had been invited to come by an American officer who wanted to become better acquainted because he was thinking of marrying me. I had met him during the war. He was a cousin of my girlfriend from boarding school. And my scholarship, I had asked for a scholarship, it didn't come. So I spent the summer first in Long Island near New York with him. I arrived with $40, $50 actually. We had to have $50 to come.
Right.
It cost me $40 out of the 50 to have my trunk delivered from the harbor to Long Island. So I had $10 and I still had to cross the country. So in Long Island, I did a lot of portrait and landscape in oil paintings, which were commissioned to me. In fact, I did some of them here. And then I crossed the country with the family of this young man. After several years between the war and 1949, we realized we were not made for each other. But we remained good friends, and I crossed the country with his wife, his mother and sister. Then I took the Greyhound bus in September to come here. And one day I was visiting, a few days after my arrival, I was visiting the fair with one of the Pomona College students, and Harrison was working at the fair, and he noticed me. And then the next morning, I saw him again in the ceramic lab. I had signed up for ceramics for free classes. But I spent the year here, and then I was engaged in France, so I went back to France. But President Line asked me to stay a second year, but I decided to go back because I was asked to go back.
Sure.
And when I was free again, a year and a half later, Harrison sent me a one-way ticket to come back to marry him.
Wonderful.
And we will have been married, very happily married, for 50 years this coming January.
That's marvelous. That's marvelous.
So this is a
looks like it's
picture.
going to work out. We're seeing you.
This is a picture of Harrison and me, the way I look now after the war. Actually, I'm older than that. This is for my 75th birthday, which was a year ago.
That's excellent.
So that's the epic.
Wonderful. That's a fantastic story, and thank you very much for sharing it with us.
From Paris, we left toward our little house in the country, which was in the region of Le Mans, just south of Le Mans, here, before the Loire, see, north of the Loire. And we always went by Chartres and Le Mans this way.